Before this episode starts, I want to let you guys know that at the end of this episode, if you stick around to the end of this episode, there is now bonus content. What I mean by bonus content is a lot of the times when we end the episodes, we stick around a little bit longer to conversate and get a little bit more of what they thought about the episode and the conversations, but they tend to share a lot more insights of things that they know or a little bit more about them. And the conversation actually gets a lot more interesting once we cut the episode. So if you stick around, and I hope you do stick around, at the end of the podcast, after the music ends, you'll be able to see and hear those conversations that we have at the end of the podcast. So I think it's going to be very, very awesome to do and very beneficial for those deeper conversations that you might be looking for, or a little bit of extra insight into who they are or things that they know about. So enjoy the episode, and don't forget to subscribe and follow the podcast.
I was a leader in two large Fortune 500 companies. That's why I'm always talking about Fortune 500 companies. So the way I see life is I've always seen it kind of as a countdown. Life started yesterday. Sometimes when people are talking about happiness, I feel like it's a little bit toxic in a way. It's leading an entire, young generation of adults and kids to kind of misinterpret that happiness is some level of brightness or darkness.
Why do you think that is, that people always say, like, happiness to me would be, living life at a beach or having, a big house, the American dream?
Achievement and losses should not really dictate happiness. Sometimes it does, right? Because we just don't know how to flip the switch. I'm really fearful, right, of like future generations not really knowing how to.
Our next guest is somebody who I think you'll really find to be very interesting on the conversation that we have today, because a lot of the topics that he talks about are very opposite to what we hear on the daily basis. A lot of times we hear, to slow down. We hear to, think about all the happiness that life gives you. But he switches it on you and he tells you to think the opposite. I think this next individual, Hector Garcia, is somebody who you really have to pay attention to on lighting the candle. Enjoy.
So Hector, when we were talking about yesterday, I didn't want to jump too much into the subject, but I was very intrigued by what you were talking about. And especially this podcast, what I've been kind of seeing is I've been getting a lot of feedback as it being very controversial, very, like opinionated as far as like what people really think about the subjects that are talked about. So what we were talking about yesterday, I was like, well, I think this is going to bring a lot of questions, a lot of opinions, and that's something definitely that it needs to be heard though. So before we get into that, Hector, if you can just give me a little bit of your background, a little bit of who Hector Garcia is, where did you come from? And I would like for you to go a little deeper into your backstory. Just tell me as much as you can soak out of your backstory.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll give you kind of like the high level general stuff that, kind of like a introduction, so to speak, and how, the way that I know, to do it based on like corporate experience. But, so just first and foremost, my name is Hector Garcia. And, the biggest thing that I like to highlight, thing I'm most proud of is I'm a dad, of three awesome kids. I call them kids, but, they're all almost adults. So 20, 18, 11-year-old, two girls, one son. And, I'm a husband, I'm thankful to say, to an amazing wife, right? If you want to go deep, I'm an only child, right? To two very incredible parents, first generation American, right? On the business side, I'm a CEO, a founder, I'm an owner of an international staffing firm named LaborShare. And, prior to that, kind of earlier in my career, in my life, in my professional life, I was a leader in two large Fortune 500 companies. That's why I'm always talking about Fortune 500 companies and the way they do business. And, my specialty was always in finance, accounting, human resources, and business development. And so, hence the easy progression into labor solutions and, the really direct focus I always have in the accounting space, right? And, I guess I could say that, I'm just a person. I love to just say I'm a person. I'm like everyone else watching this video. I just always find myself grinding and trying to hit targets, right? So if people know me, I'm always pushing and pushing, right? And so that's in a nutshell who I am. I don't know if you want to know more.
Kind of what I really like to get out of every time I have a guest on is really getting to know your background growing up as a kid. Is business something you've always wanted to do? You grew up as an only child. How was that like? How did you get into business? How did you kind of grow up with your journey from, like, let's start with your teenage years. How did that develop?
Well, so it's funny because I'm not sure if like I said, I'm a pretty normal person, right? And I always feel like I had a normal upbringing, right? And kind of when I start reflecting, kind of in the questions that you're asking, I grew up in a family where we didn't have a lot of money, right? My mom was a factory worker, kind of the earlier, part of my life. My dad, he was, he was a somebody who always had to work with his hands, out in the sun. He was a welder. They didn't have an entrepreneurial spirit, and they still don't, right? My parents were the ones that, said, hey, get a good trade, get a good job, and, take care of your family, get a house. And then, that's the key to success, right? And like I said, I was an only child, right? So I didn't know what it was like to have brothers and sisters. We had a big extended family, but, I always found from my parents that, we just kind of stick to us as a family in a unit, and we would progress, right? I'm, the entrepreneurial stuff, really didn't come until, it didn't come until out of necessity, right? Because again, I didn't know that we didn't have money growing up. I didn't know, that Christmases were supposed to be differently, that like they are for my kids now. I the Santa Claus and all that stuff. I didn't believe in Santa Claus. I didn't even know that was a thing, right? That existed. But I guess humble beginnings is the way I like to describe it, right? I think I told you, Isaac, hey, I don't like to, talk too much about my childhood because it highlights kind of stuff from my parents. When we're having cookouts nowadays, I'm super proud of where I came from, kind of how much my parents have progressed since they were young, Mexico and just progressing in the U.S. and that kind of thing. And I always hate to highlight some of those things just specifically because, I'm super proud and they're very prideful people. It's hard for me to tell all the stories, right? Because my parents kind of cringe. I think like most parents do. It's like, hey, those are not stories that, we want aired out just because, they were times that they used to struggle. But I always thought it was like, man, these are amazing times, right? And I think that's generally where my outlook on life comes from, is they never really painted a dark picture, or a negative light. And, so I've always thought that it was just life, and I think that's kind of what sparked the conversation that you and I were having yesterday about it, right?
Yeah, and so I kind of want to jump right into that right off the bat, is because what you were kind of mentioning right now is that you grow up in probably some of the hardest times and some of the hardest struggles that your family had to go through, that you had to go through on your own. And so the conversation that we were having yesterday was very controversial to the typical teenager now and the typical lifestyle that we live now. And so I kind of want you to touch base on kind of the conversation that we were having yesterday, as far as how life kind of seems different for you as far as when you were a kid to kids now.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So, just to kind of highlight some of the pictures that I have behind me, they're pictures and like murals of Segundo Barrio, right? So that's kind of where the humble beginnings that I'm talking about. My dad is from Segundo Barrio. He grew up there. I'm proud of that, right? That's kind of his roots and our heritage. But my dad would say, like, man, I couldn't wait to get out of there, right? And that's what I mean by there's just different perspectives in life that we all don't know about, right? And so on my dad's side, he was always he's always talking about, like, he's proud of when he was able to leave Segundo Barrio, right, and get the whole family out. There's a lot of siblings, and my mom had same humble beginnings, right? But when we were talking, yesterday, I think it just sparked. I maybe saw a podcast or had a conversation with somebody about the mindset and how people are looking out for happiness so much, right? And I think that sparked a kind of a controversial tone in our conversation yesterday. I don't know if it is controversy or not, but it's just a way of thinking or not thinking, right? And the way I see life is I've always seen it kind of as a countdown, right? And if we really put into perspective, maybe I live till 60 to 70, if God willing, I'm able to get there. And I'm always a believer and a preacher of, life started yesterday, right? It doesn't start tomorrow. It doesn't start when we start a business. It doesn't start when we get X amount of money. Life started yesterday, right? And I've always been of the mindset or the philosophy of just building more, grinding harder, and then being, able to pay it forward, right? And then I sprinkle in, the stuff of like, hey, life is never going to be greater than a life spent with someone you love. Find some, have kids, have a wife, and just life is just way, way different when you have that level of relationship, right? And then I think I told you, I was like, hey guys, like life is like oxygen. Happiness is like oxygen, right? We don't really understand that it's there until we, take a deep breath or actually focus on your breathing. And then you say, wow, yeah, that's how I'm actually breathing in oxygen. And so for me, happiness is similar to that, right? And, I think yesterday what I was trying to communicate, and now I have kind of better thought through it, is, sometimes when people are talking about happiness, I feel like it's a little bit toxic in a way, given that, it's leading an entire, young generation of adults and kids to kind of misinterpret that happiness is some level of brightness or darkness, right? I think that's what we were talking about yesterday, and you were like, what? I can't believe you said that. But, it's to me, it's a misinterpretation of happiness, right? To think about it in terms of brightness or darkness, right? And I think that's what we talked about yesterday, and you were kind of a little bit shocked, right? Because I think the people on the podcast before me were saying like, hey, happiness kind of, I think, something to strive for or achieve. And then I think my point of view that it's just there. We just got to focus on it, or we got to realize that it's there, right?
Why do you think that is, that people always say, like, happiness to me would be, living life at a beach or having, a big house, the American dream. Now, you seem to think about it opposite. Like, you also mentioned the light and darkness to happiness. Can kind of go a little bit more into that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the thing to clarify is that I usually think of life as a kind of a scale, right? Like a countdown. And, when you look at life like that, you kind of, you look at it backwards, so to speak, of what most people are trying to talk about and preach, right? It's like, the way I look at it is like we have X amount of days and X amount of years in our life, right? And since I'm counting down, I'm always trying to think of like, am I living today or yesterday the way that I should be living, right? And most of that stuff comes with, good and bad, right? I mean, losses and wins. I think we were talking about that yesterday. And when people have losses, and it's a consistent loss, right? The same thing in sports, the same thing in life is like you always have a lot of losses. People will attach like a level of darkness, depression, sadness to that stuff, right? Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, those times they suck, right? I mean, like, let's be real. But there's a lot of wins most of the time. And like I said, it's a scale. If you look at it from 1 to 100, or you look at 70 years, right? Like for me, I have like 11,000 or so days left in my life. That's kind of what I calculated. And I can guarantee that there's going to be a lot of losses between now and then, right? But then there's also going to be a lot of wins. And so when I look at kind of light and dark, or lightness or brightness and darkness, I try and not focus so much on the losses and the wins to dictate my happiness, right? Because I mean, it's like 11,000 days left in my life. And, when I take a deep breath and I realize that I'm here and I'm living and life started yesterday, I realize that I'm happy, right? I'm happy being. And so, achievement and losses should not really dictate happiness. Sometimes it does, right? Because we just don't know how to flip the switch. And I think yesterday, kind of what caused me to say, like, hey, I'm really fearful, right, of like future generations not really knowing how to turn the light on. And that's kind of what I meant. I don't know if you need more clarification on that.
So you mentioned a couple of things. You mentioned a lot of the times, a lot of the conversations or the sentences that you were saying were concerns to that ticking time clock of life. You just mentioned you calculated your days of how many days you have left. Why is that such a big concern for you? Why is that such a big concern to calculate how many days you have left? And also, I think what you're trying to kind of say is like living life to your fullest without having to worry so much like those losses that you take in life. It's like people tend to hold those to them and then deal throughout their whole life holding those. And I think one of the key things that we also mentioned before was that people go into depression because of these type of things, right? Like somebody might not have something that they want, so they tend to ignore that situation and they cope it with something else, right? And so I want you to touch on those specific things that you mentioned, is like, why are you so concerned? And you mentioned it a lot with the ticking time that we have left. And I take it as living life in its moment. Why? Explain to me kind of your thought process behind all that.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know what? So just to clarify, right? It's not that I'm concerned about the time that I have left, right? It's just that it's a reality, right? And so whenever we're born on day one, right? And then we die on X day, right? Whatever God decides. But, if we look at it in terms of scale or a countdown, that helps us understand that life started yesterday, right? It doesn't start when we graduate high school. It doesn't start when we graduate college, university. It doesn't start when we get our first big job, when we have kids, when we get married. That's not when life starts, right? And life starts yesterday. I tell this to my kids, I explain it to my wife, and anybody who generally I talk to, is there's nothing to wait for, right? Life started yesterday. And so as a result, we should be building immediately, and building more in our life. We should be grinding further, right? Like I mentioned earlier. And, we should be striving to pay it forward, and the way I look at life is, because it is a countdown, we have to build momentum, and time is the builder of momentum. I mean, fortunately or unfortunately, right? And so if you look at, the way somebody pitches a baseball, right? They don't pitch a baseball from like a static position. They wind up and they throw, right? It's how they pitch so fast. And so life is the same thing. If you live like life started yesterday, you understand the momentum and the luck that we have to build and throw a fast pitch, right? And that's what I mean by like, hey, at 16, 17 years old, we should already be striving for our 10-year mark, our 20-year mark, our 30-year mark. And if we live like that, when we look at the countdown on life, you can tell yourself, you can look back and say, man, I really wound up, right? And I pitched as fast as humanly possible. So at year 10, year 20, year 30, right? You can feel proud of kind of the effort that you've put in. And so the reason that I say that I'm concerned is more so of people thinking that they have time, right? You've heard people say like, well, I'm not going to go to university. I'm not going to go to college. That's fine, right? Because I've known a lot of people in business, they don't have degrees or they do have degrees, and it just comes down to the grind, right? Really, in reality, it comes down to the grind, really how street smart you are, how savvy you are to kind of navigate certain areas of business. But, if you look at, again, the trajectory and how fast you can move, from 16 to 25, it'll change your life. But if you take a pause, like social media is asking a lot or telling people to do, like, hey, you know what? Happiness is more important than going to college, than grinding at an 8 to 5 or a 9 to 5, however they call it. They're prioritizing kind of happiness or this facade of happiness, or this grass is greener on the other side. And what ends up happening is that pause doesn't really allow them to kind of wind up and throw the fast pitch, right? Or throw as fast as you possibly can. And so the reason that I say it's important to wind up, right, at 15, 16, 17 years old, so that you can push through high school, because that's, again, life started yesterday. Just because you graduate high school doesn't mean you need to, it's not a start point. And so if you're able to wind up, several years back, you're going to hit a target a lot faster, right? And in life, sometimes what ends up what happens in life is people take a pause, and then all of a sudden you don't have the funds to do what you want in life, right? People wait too long, and then they're like, okay, well, I'm going to retire, and then I'll do the stuff that makes me happy. And to me, it's like you should have wound up at 16, 17 years old so you can start doing what makes you happy at 25, 26. That's reasonable because you can make good amount of money during that time.
So my question here is, there's two questions to this. Is you hear it a lot of times, and I've heard it a lot with different people that I've been fortunate to talk to, is the biggest stigma in life is to hold off. You have time. You're still young. People always say that at 35, you're still young. At 40, you're still young. You have time, and that seems to be their motive. My first question to that is, obviously, I think you think that's a bunch of BS, right? And then my second question to that is, do you think as generations keep going that we're getting softer as, in the world that we're living in?
I don't know if it's a matter of soft, like, I don't think it's a matter of that, right? I think, so like, let me give you an example, right? So let me take it back to kind of my life, and it may embarrass my parents just a little bit, but, so I have a distinct memory of when I was a kid, right? I was pretty little. I mean, I maybe 7, 8 years old or so. And I have a distinct memory of when it was just a night, right? And I was sitting on my parents' bed. My dad was there, my mom was there, and it was dark. And I remember my dad holding a flashlight, and my mom kind of rifling through a dresser cabinet. And I remember she pulled out a small box of like white candles, right? And it's such a weird, very distinct memory that brings me a lot of happiness, right? But I remember that's what was going on, right? We were all sitting kind of on the bed. She went into the cabinet, grabbed the candles. She put the candle on the dresser and then pulled out a matchbook. And she lit the candle and she like explained to me like, hey, this is how you light a candle. And I remember being kind of like excited and happy, like such a cool thing. We're lighting a candle. Well, 7, 8 years old, maybe that's somewhat stimulating, right? But I remember that as just a very happy moment. Okay, we're in the dark. My dad has a flashlight. My mom's lighting a candle. And then years pass, right? And I remember explaining like, hey, this story one time at a cookout or around my kids. I don't remember exactly where. And I remember kind of my mom's face turning a little bit red. She didn't want to talk about that. And, the reality of that situation is that was a very dark moment for my parents, right? The light got cut off, right? There's no electricity, but it's one of my happiest moments, right? Because my mom taught me how to light a candle, right? And so that is like a very distinct situation in my life where somebody taught me when it's dark, you can light a candle. Right? You can flip the light switch. And so when you ask, is this generation getting soft? I don't think so, right? I think it's just a matter of somebody teaching them to flip the light switch or to light a candle, right? And if more people understand that is within our control, right, then people are not going to look at it as a brightness or a darkness situation, right? It's more of an us and having the ability to change the situation. And so, parents, if you're watching this, I'm sorry for having to tell the story, but it's a happy moment for me in a dark situation, right? And that's kind of how I live my life. So we just need to teach this to more younger people, to our kids, so that it doesn't progressively get worse, right? We don't want anybody sitting on the bed in the dark and feeling like it's, unfixable.
I love how you put that together. Of it really is like the moment that you were living in, and then you used that metaphor of lighting up a match to lighten up the situation that you were in, both internally and externally. What I'm trying to figure out how to ask this is what do you tell your son now? Your son's around in his 20s, right? And I think that's what you told me. And what advice do you give him? How do you teach him?
Yeah, so my daughter's 20, my son's 18, and then I have a little one that's a daughter that's 11. And I preach the same thing, right? And I teach this ability to just turn the lights on. Okay, and whether they do it, I have no control over that because they're already adults, right? But they at least know that at this point in their life, they have the ability to turn the lights on, right? And so I find them finding those moments where, yeah, let's say they're just having a shitty day, because it happens. It's part of life, right? We take losses and we take wins, and it's just part of life. It's just a scale, right? Hopefully you have more wins on that scale than you do losses. But what I see is that they're able to see when they turn the light on and it impacts their mood and makes them happy and makes them grateful and makes them realize that, cool, they're on the right track, right? And it's just a scale, it's just life. And they're able to kind of understand in the moment that life started yesterday and it's all about being happy with what we have, right? But again, they're influenced by social media. They're influenced by friends that maybe don't have the same thought process. But all I can do as a parent is kind of really showcase this ability to, again, turn the light on or flip the switch and light the candle, right?
I'm gonna be very, very honest here. I think like the way that I see it is around people my age, they tend to not have some type of roadmap of where they want to go in their life. A lot of the times it's just, and I like how you mentioned the social media part and your phone and stuff like that. I know the previous guest mentioned to always just put the phone down, and it's not something that it's a distraction of your life, right? And so a lot of the times people try to fit into this stigma that they need to be a certain persona, that they need to be looked a certain way in order to truly find happiness within themselves, right?
Yeah.
What do you think about kind of how social media and the news outlets and what people see, how that affects somebody growing up in this generation? And I really want to touch on that, on the generations parts of like how different our generation could be, or how you think it could be different without having all these, I guess, fragile topics that are now fragile, that used to not be fragile back then, right? When we were back in the days, it's fragile because we pay so much attention to these news outlets, social media. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think that social media impacts everyone, right? I don't think it's just a young generation. I think they're just, again, they've not been taught as much as we have how to turn the light on, right? I keep repeating it over and over again because I think it's a skill set that you need to have when you're being raised, when you're growing, is you need to understand that it's within your control, right? And I think that social media can be a bad thing. I think it can be a good thing, right? I mean, I've heard, people on podcasts and people, that I've talked to that say like, oh, it's not good to kind of, you have to be your own self. You have to be, be who you are, kind of understand what's in your soul, and then be your own person. But without people to emulate, I mean, you really don't have a target to hit, right? And so I think social media, depending on the way that you look at life or the outlook that you have on life, there's a shit ton of targets out there, right, that you're following, that you can emulate, right, that you can focus on being more like, to start developing yourself as a person, right? There's a lot of really shitty people on social media, and there's a lot of awesome people on social media. Now we get to look into the lives of executives of, billion-dollar companies. We get to look into the lives of, movie stars and, social, influencers and stuff like that. And we look at the things that they have, the things that they don't have, the things that make them happy, right? And sometimes we use that as kind of a target, right? And then we do the work behind it. We can get to a level of success that, we maybe never thought existed, right? Like, again, when I was a kid, I didn't know whether we had money or not. It was just, I existed. Right now, younger people can see like, yeah, I'm broke. Like, I'm broke. I don't have anything because this guy on social media has X, Y, and Z. But rather than kind of being, somewhat envious or being bitter about it, start winding up, right? Think about the fast pitch and how fast that's going to land. And if you wind up early, right, in the metaphor of like a fast pitch, you'll be able to hit the target a lot faster, or you'll be able to hit the target, period, right? Because if you just look at social media and you don't do anything to get or reach kind of the individual that you're trying to emulate, I'm not saying be them or pretend to be them. I'm saying look at what it is, the qualities that they have that you like or you enjoy, and do what you got to do to get there, right? And so that's what I mean by that.
These next three questions that I was thinking as you were talking kind of line up from your beginning to your middle stages of figuring out, or anybody figuring out who they are, and then now who you are now. But the first stage of that, and the first question to that three-part is, what is anything that of your younger 18-year-old tell to your 18-year-old Heck?
Sorry, Isaac, you were kind of breaking up there. Say that one more time.
This next three questions are kind of broken out into like how somebody moves on throughout life. So, from when you were younger to kind of figuring yourself out, and then where you're at now. And I guess that first part to that question would be, would you tell 18-year-old Hector anything different from what you know now? Would you change anything at 18 years old, knowing kind of what you know now?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's funny because I tell so many people that I come in contact with, and, if you're a person that I've come in contact with, I probably told you that you can do better, right? That you can achieve what you want to achieve, right? And this is from family, friends, acquaintances, business partners, that kind of thing, because I believe it, right? And you can literally achieve anything that you want to achieve. You just got to grind for it. And so if I could go back and talk to my 18-year-old self, I would have said grind earlier. And I started super, super young. I started grinding at 16, 17 years old. But, I guess I would go back and say, like, it's not enough. You can do better, right? You can gain more momentum. And when you get enough, when you land enough money, right? Be smarter, build more, and be more effective, right? That's what I would have told myself, because, right now I'm 38, going on 39 years old. And I feel like I didn't make the most out of the first years of my life, right? And I did a lot of great things, but I could have done better, right? And so is when I come in contact with people and my kids, I always encourage them to understand that they can do much more than what they're doing, right? And I mean it in the most positive light possible. I try and say it encouragingly, always, right? So that's what I would have gone back and told myself at 18. It's just go harder, man.
And so throughout that whole moment of grinding and trying to really strive for where you're going, the second part to that question would be, what was those losses that you went through? What was that step downwards that you took that you had to take your own advice on it, as far as like, well, man, you got to light the candle up again. You had to, get back up on your feet. Tell me one of those stories where you had to take your own advice.
Well, so, I mean, like I said, I didn't have to take my advice about lighting the candle, because I would just do it naturally, right? It's how I was raised. And, but I've taken a lot of losses in life, right? I've gotten divorced, right? I had kids very young in life. I look at it as a win now, but, somebody that is just not comfortable with having kids like in high school, sees that as a kind of a loss, right? But, I had a setback kind of in university. I didn't do things correctly. I mean, I screwed my credit up when I was super young, right? Trying to just survive and make ends meet and that kind of thing. So those are all losses, right? That, again, didn't define my happiness at the time, because, I was happy. I was surviving. I was doing what I had to do. But again, I didn't know whether, I've never looked at it as like darkness or brightness, right? And so, I've had losses. I've gone for promotions and I haven't, I didn't get them, right? I was just not in the right place and right time. And I think I didn't work hard enough for it, right? The person who got it probably outworked the shit out of me. Let's be real. And that's why they got the role. And so, as time progressed, I started making a ton of money at a company that I was working at before. I started buying things. I started attaining all of the things, the house, the cars, and all this fun stuff. And, it is a very typical saying. It's like, when you have all this stuff, it doesn't even mean anything. And it's 100% the truth, right? But it makes life a whole of a hell a lot easier, because now where I'm at is I can choose whether I have that or I don't, right? I don't have to feel the need that, man, I need that stuff. I want it. And so now my trajectory is just different, right? It's just about building and building and building. Hopefully that answers your question.
It does, but I kind of want you to dig a little bit deeper on this question, because you mentioned three interesting things that a lot of people probably listening are either going through the same thing or have gone through the same thing and are still looking for an answer. Maybe there might not even be an answer to it, but you mentioned the divorce ruining your credit, and you mentioned, leaving university. Tell me a little bit about those moments. Tell me a little bit more about the feelings and the emotions and the stuff you were going through as those things were going on.
Well, so, I was super young right? The first time, my two older kids are from a previous marriage, and we were very young, and I was like a typical Mexican partner, right? Where you're kind of like machismo and you expect certain things, that kind of thing, which was really the stupidest thing that I could have ever done, right? I mean, I was young and stupid. And, I think that some of those things kind of led to, failure in a relationship and that kind of thing, where in reality, I could have done just so much better, right? I could have, I could, I could have been grinding a lot more in my own relationship. And so that was a loss, but I mean, it is what it is, right? I mean, it's life. Life is going to throw a lot of things at you. Some people, they're just not meant to be, right? And I'm also a believer of everything kind of happens for a reason. It's kind of in God's will, that kind of thing. And again, yeah, I felt sad during that time, right? But I just kept grinding, man, because I didn't know any different. I didn't know, like, man, I should be depressed at this very moment. I had two kids that I had to keep working for and grinding. I mean, I was there creating budgets when I was super broke and trying to make $18 stretch for, 2 to 4 weeks, and again, it was just a thing. It was just part of life. And more people need to understand that if you're out there and you're budgeting pennies or dollars, or you're like, I don't know how I'm going to pay my bills. It's normal. It happens. It sucks. And I feel for you because I've been there, but it's okay. And so long as you grind and work harder, you will pull yourself out of it. You got to flip the light switch, right? And that's just the way I see it.
I come to that third question now, and I think leading up to this question after what you just said really ties everything in as a whole. Is now, what is the true meaning of happiness to you? What is that meaning of success? What is that true meaning of success? If you were to define it in the dictionary, what does that mean to you? What does that definition of happiness means to you after putting all that into perspective?
Well, again, like happiness, I'll say it again, right? Happiness is just kind of like oxygen in the air, right? You really have to focus and understand that you're alive. It kind of comes down to gratefulness, I guess, is what I'm trying to communicate. Some people feel happy, some people feel unhappy, but in reality, once you kind of break it down and you take a deep breath, and I encourage anybody watching it, just you're breathing kind of as you're watching it, but you don't realize you're breathing. Just stop, take a deep breath, and then you'll realize you were just breathing oxygen, right? And so that's the way that I look at happiness. It's just there, right? And you just have to take a deep breath and kind of realize that it's there. Whether you're going through kind of like I said, the dark times or the losses and the wins, it's just there. You'll find it. You just got to focus on it. And then what was the other question?
The other question is, now your success, like, what is that real meaning of success to you? Not the cars, the house, not the money. Like, what is that real definition of success if you were to define it in a dictionary?
Yeah. Man, I guess success would be, for me, is to be able to pay it forward. I mean, that's truly something that so many people in my life have done for me. And it's kind of gotten me to this point, right? So I would say that the true meaning of success for me is having the ability to pay it forward. And it's just, it could be anything, right? But advice, encouragement, financial well-being. So I think it's success is more about helping other people than it is helping me and finding my happiness, right? Because we can help people flip the switch, light the candle a lot more than we can getting those quick satisfactions for our own life, right? And I think as long as you teach people that, that's pretty much success, right? Businesses fail, they succeed, and so long as you can get on the boat and move forward with it and try it, I mean, I think that's a success in itself, right?
And I like it because I live off of the same like morals, is that if you're able to help out somebody who actually needs the help, or you may have something that can really be of benefit to them, like why not give it to them? And they would be more of need of it than what you would too, you know. And I kind of spoke to you a little bit about like how privileged we are, how grateful we should be living, and how we're living here compared to that when I took that trip to Mexico, and you see a whole different lifestyle of how people live, and then you come back here and you're complaining about your phone not being charged. And so it's a lot of putting things into perspective. So I can 100% agree with you on that. My last question here is this tradition that we usually have, and it's where this last guest leaves a question for this next guest, not knowing who the next guest is going to be. So our last guest was Daniel Burke, and he left a two-parter question for you. And I think this is really interesting for you to answer, because out of everything you talked about, I think this question really matches into what people should really be grateful for. And so the question is, what was the last time you shared something with somebody that you loved, and how much they meant to you? And then the second part to that is, who is somebody that you love that you still need to reach out to and talk to them and tell them how much you appreciate them?
Man, so thankfully, right? And it's thankfully because of the way that I look at life, right? I try not to leave stones unturned, right? And so, I've recently had conversations with my dad, and thankfully I still have him. My mom, thankfully I still have her. And they're in-depth, deep conversations about how much I appreciate them, right? I tell them that I love them. And, I tell my wife every day that I love her and how much I appreciate her. And I have these very deep and meaningful conversations with my kids all the time about what they can do to push forward and to build momentum and to do what it is that they want to do, right? But I give them the real talk, and I tell them that they need to wind up, right? And so today I can confidently say that every single person, those kind of, those core individuals that are in my life that I really feel strongly about supporting and protecting, that kind of thing, is that there's no stones left unturned, right? I could probably die today and they would feel like I have loved them, and I have pushed them, and I have encouraged them. So I'm pretty proud of that. That's something that I try and do always.
Do you regret anything from when you were younger to where you're at now? Is there anything you regret?
Wasting a shitload of time. And that's why I say wind up as soon as humanly possible. Life started yesterday. And so it's just wasting time. That's the biggest regret. If you ask an older person that's 60, 70, 80 years old, and you hear it all the time, is if you ask one of those individuals, is they just wish they had more time, right? And the reality of it is that there's an expiration, right? And if you look at life as a countdown, I think you will value each day as it turns more and more, right? And so my biggest regret is wasting time, right?
What question would you like to leave the next guest? But actually, before you answer that, what legacy are you trying to leave behind? Most importantly, I think, is in the perspective of your kids. Like, who do you want your kids to see their dad as? And who do you, that's a two-parter, I guess, too, is who do you think that how do you want your kids to remember you as, or the legacy, and then also Hector Garcia as a person?
Yeah, man, that's a tough one. So I think, after this conversation and kind of finding how successful my parents were at teaching me like this critical skill, I think maybe if my kids are ever talking at this capacity with somebody about me, I would just love for them to have a moment or a situation where I taught them to light the candle, right? Because man, that's just such a huge value in life. And if they can at least say that I helped them light a candle at least once in their life, I'm good. That's that's a big win.
What's that question that you want to leave for the next guest? Not knowing who it is.
For the next guest, I would say, man, you have a lot of good guests on, right? That really do.
Next one's really good.
Yeah, you have a lot of guests on that do pay a lot forward, right? And that's kind of what I love about your content. And the people you're surrounding yourself with are solid people, right? Which is great. It's a good thing that you're doing. I think maybe let's go with the question of like, are they doing what they can to teach people how to light the candle, right? So, to teach people how to flip the switch and realize that happiness is here. It's there. And they just got to look for it. I don't know if that's specific enough.
I like it. I'm writing it down. I think that's a really interesting question to ask because a lot of people are still in that phase of trying to figure out how they can turn on that switch for themselves and take that next decision that they need to make without being scared about it or things like that. So I think that's a very...
Let me tell you, Isaac, I am not perfect, right? No, but if I can do one thing perfect is to teach people that they can flip the light switch and they can get anything that they want in life so long as they make moves to do it, right? And so I have regrets, I have mistakes that I've made in my life, but at the end of the day, if I can talk to you, if I can talk to somebody else and I can say, dude, fucking do it, you can, you'll get there, all the better.
I hope we're still recording, Daniel. Are we still recording?
Yeah, I always record afterwards. Yep. We never use it, but I always record it because sometimes some fire gets spit afterward, and that's what's going on right now.
So Hector, before I let you go, I wanna start introducing Daniel to like at the end of every episode, and I want Daniel. I don't know if you have any questions for Hector because I know you're always saying, "Oh, I was wondering this and this and that." So I don't know if you have.
I do questions. Have a question. I'm a very strange thinker, opinionated in certain things, and I would kind of like to know or kind of get your perspective because I kind of think the same way as you do. Very old school thinking. I think hard work can outbeat anybody that is just lazy, that's born with talent. You work hard, you can get where you need to be. I had this conversation with some friends of mine, and we talked about why society seems to be on a downfall right now. Which I agree with it in a sense. And I think, in my way of looking at it, I feel like it's a lot of the social media that's out there, and just so much an overabundance of information that isn't true or could be true, could be not. And how do you see the difference between your parents' generation to your generation? And I hate to do this to Isaac, but even Isaac and myself's generation, the generation that's after Isaac's and this newer generation, what do you think is the big factor that is causing these dramatic changes within the past, 20 years.
Yeah. I mean, so for sure influence, right? I mean, everybody knows that, like, you know, being envious is like part of life too, right? I mean, sometimes you look at, the shoes somebody has and you're like, man, I wish I had those shoes. And then you go on the internet and then you look and you're like, fuck, I cannot afford those shoes. And you just wish that you had them, right? So it's some level of envy, right? It is, sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative. But I think the influence that everyone has right now, and this includes any generation. My dad, I show him how to get on Instagram and TikTok, right? And so he sees, like, he's a big Cowboys fan. And he's like, man, this person has this, this, and that. And it's like, hey, how do I get this? How do I get it? But the difference is that, my dad's generation is super content. I was telling Isaac yesterday, my dad, so prideful. He has a plot of land out there in Socorro. And, he had a trailer on there for so many years and eventually built the house. And my dad is so happy with his house, kind of like not being, at the same quality of a mansion. Concrete's broken, house is halfway built, but my dad loves to sit outside in the porch and he is 100% happy. He sees social media, he's like, yeah, I want this, but he's content. That's a big difference with, like, my generation and his, whereas mine, we're now thinking like, we need to grind for it, we need to work for it, we're going to get it, right? And then I think the younger generation doesn't understand either of the two as much, right? I think a lot of young people understand, like Isaac and even you that's doing this right now, right? You guys are grinders. You guys are doing what you have to do to get somewhere, right? But there's a lot of people that look at, like, the Logan Pauls and look at the Twitch streamers and all this stuff, and they're like, man, if I just stay gaming long enough and I act stupid enough on the stream, I'm going to get somewhere. I might hit it big. But they're not really grinding, right? They're not doing all the other stuff that it takes to get somewhere. And I think that's the biggest difference, right? Is that they think they have time, like Isaac said earlier. And man, time is our biggest enemy, no matter what. I don't know where people got that they have all the time in the world, but we don't, right? I mean, there's an end in sight. And it's crazy that people don't focus on it. It's kind of morbid, but if you look at it as a countdown and you make the most out of all the initial days, it's kind of positive, right? And so I think between those three generations, or however many there are on this planet, I mean, that's the way it is, right? So I think what we can do, right, is the people that we do come in contact with, the people who we do surround ourselves with, is you got to pay it forward amongst each other and for them, right? It's kind of like similar to what you guys are doing. I saw your first podcast and you guys are big supporters of each other. So can you imagine if you guys are doing this for every single person that you come in contact with, how much more or how much better will that circle be? And if you ask them to do the same that you've done for them to others, can you imagine how much impact that'll have, right? And I think that's just not happening enough.
I completely agree. We do live in somewhat of a selfish world. I was talking to, I don't know if it was Isaac or somebody else, that I'm Colombian. I was born in Colombia. I was brought at an early age here. My wife, on the contrary, she was born here with Mexican parents. And I love going back home because the people out there, you're struggling, you need help. They don't know you, but they'll go out there and help you.
Yeah.
Such a different mindset, such a different just environment. But I had one last question. I don't want to take too much of your time, and I appreciate you taking the time. Thank you, Isaac, as well, for letting me kind of sneak in here at the end. As an entrepreneur yourself, how do you see the different challenges that you faced when you were, developing and growing yourself as an entrepreneur? And how different is it to be an entrepreneur when you first started it, and if you were to have, everything got erased here next week and you have to start from zero, how would you have to, I guess, switch or maybe possibly change the certain techniques or ways that you started when you were becoming an entrepreneur? So I guess the basic question is, what's the difference between when you started your entrepreneurship to nowadays? How would be the big difference, or what would be the big difference in becoming an entrepreneur now?
So, so to be super, super clear, I'm somewhat of a new entrepreneur, right? And have you ever heard this concept of a intrapreneur, right? Where you're working for a corporation and you're acting as it's your own business, right? That's what I was my entire career. For 20 years, I spent grinding as hard as I grind now in my own business for somebody else's business, right? And so I really think that to develop somebody else's business or to develop your own, it really all comes down to fundamentals. And 100%. And being able to light the candle, okay? Because you're going to have to light the candle a lot, right? And the fundamentals are super important. That's why you see so many young business owners, right? There's like so many young millionaires and billionaires, and it just so happens that they learned the fundamentals earlier, right? Like for me, it was a skill, it was a progression. I learned certain fundamentals at the beginning, then in the middle, and then, I would say by my 8th year as a entrepreneur working for these big corporations, I was a fucking killer, right? And I knew the politics. I knew how to talk to people. I knew how to shake hands. I knew how to like smooth, and I knew how to talk to people. I knew who to talk to, who not to talk to. It's the same in entrepreneurship, right? You go to a networking event and you're like, nah, that guy is not on the level, right? Let's just say they're just always distracted, right? And they're just playing. It's a game. It's a hobby. It's not somebody that I generally will associate with, right? And so, I mean, if we're talking about like skill, like how it was before and how it is now, I think it's all the same. It's just a matter of fundamentals, right? So for me, I love having a really, really clear platform of finance, accounting, human resources, business development, and then leadership, right? And so I feel really, really strong in those areas. Where I lacked was in sales, right? Is having the ability to go out and land business. And so all I have been doing is try and develop the fundamentals, right? I've spent so much money on understanding sales acumen, the psychology behind it. And so the only thing that I'm doing different now is I'm investing in the fundamentals that I just am not an expert in, right? And all the other stuff, I can hire experts, that's how I ended up finding Isaac. Is like, I knew I was terrible at social media. I still am. And I said, I need to find somebody. I interviewed like 5 different agencies, and Isaac was the youngest person. He looked like the hungriest. And I said, let's do it. Right. Because I'm drawn to that kind of ambition and grind. It's just the way it is. I'd rather give my money to somebody who I know is working for it and just grinding, and I mean that's just the way it is, right? But I mean, is there a difference? I don't know if there's a difference. I just really think that business all comes down to fundamentals and ability to turn the candle on, if that makes sense.
That's awesome. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much. I don't know if Isaac has anything else.
No, I appreciate it, Hector.
But awesome, guys. You guys are doing super awesome job. The podcast, badass. The editing is good. Dude, keep going, man. It's just fucking good.
Appreciate it.
I like it.